At the heart of biblical history, Sodom and Gomorrah have become synonymous with destruction and judgment. But what really led to this catastrophe? Imagine a city where corruption and depravity reigned, where morality was just a distant memory. What happened behind the gates of these cities? Voices crying out for justice were ignored, and greed took over. What if I told you that the true reason for their destruction goes far beyond what most people think? An outcome that is not just about punishment, but a reflection of a profound spiritual deviation. Have you ever stopped to think about what this means for us today? What lessons can we draw from this ancient tragedy that resonate in our modern lives? As the dust of destruction settled, the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah echoed through the centuries. And this story, full of twists and turns, still provokes us. What do these cities teach us about compassion, justice, and the true character of God? Get ready to dive into a narrative that challenges prejudices and reveals deep truths. Practices of sexual immorality. The culture of Sodom and Gomorrah, according to biblical narratives, was a true cauldron of behaviors considered immoral. Promiscuity was rampant, and sexual relations were seen as mere acts of pleasure, devoid of any commitment or love. In this society, sexuality seemed to have lost its deeper meaning, becoming a game. People sought to satisfy their desires without worrying about the consequences, which, according to the scriptures, eventually attracted divine wrath to these cities. Additionally, homosexuality is frequently mentioned in discussions about the morality of Sodom and Gomorrah. The city, in its unrestrained pursuit of carnal pleasures, did not distinguish between genders in its practices. This sexual freedom, which might seem liberating to some, was, to others, a sign of moral degradation. What was lost, according to the narrative, was the idea of mutual love and respect, replaced by impulsive and selfish behavior. Critics of the time, as well as many today, argue that promiscuity and homosexuality were not the only problems, but rather the way these practices were taken to extremes. The lack of boundaries and the absence of a shared morality contributed to an environment where respect for others was eroded. Thus, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah serves as a warning about the dangers of a society that does not put brakes on its passions. The biblical narrative also suggests that these practices were not just personal, but reflected a collective culture. People, by engaging in these practices, created an environment where immorality was the norm, and any attempt to challenge this behavior was quickly silenced. The story, therefore, leads us to reflect on how morality can be eroded in a social context that values pleasure above all. Finally, sexual immorality in Sodom and Gomorrah was not just a matter of individual behavior, but a systemic failure that permeated the entire society. This lack of moral boundaries contributed to social collapse, culminating in their destruction, and serves as a reminder that ethical values are fundamental to collective harmony. Lack of hospitality. Another negative aspect of the culture of Sodom and Gomorrah was the notorious lack of hospitality. At that time, welcoming travelers and strangers was considered a sacred virtue, a fundamental value that united communities. In contrast, these cities became known for their rejection and even violence against those who passed through. This lack of hospitality was not just a matter of individual behavior, but a cultural characteristic that reflected the essence of their societies. Travelers venturing into Sodom and Gomorrah likely faced not only indifference, but even hostility. The idea of offering shelter and protection was completely inverted. Instead of being welcomed with open arms, strangers were seen as threats. This mentality not only dehumanized outsiders, but also weakened community bonds, creating an environment of distrust and fear. Besides being an ethical transgression, the lack of hospitality had practical implications. Communities that did not care for their visitors missed the opportunity to learn and enrich their cultures. The exchange of experiences and knowledge, which could occur through interaction with travelers, was replaced by isolationist and hostile behavior. Thus, the culture of Sodom and Gomorrah became inward-looking, stagnant, and inflexible. The biblical narrative highlights that the lack of hospitality was seen as a grave offense, not just against travelers, but also against divine values. Hospitality was a way to reflect God's kindness and generosity, and by denying it, these cities were challenging a fundamental principle of community life. Consequently, divine condemnation became an inevitable outcome. The absence of hospitality in Sodom and Gomorrah is a warning about the dangers of selfishness and lack of empathy. When a society refuses to welcome others, it moves away not only from ethical values, but also from its own humanity. The story reminds us of the importance of extending a hand to others and how this simple action can have a profound and lasting impact. Violence and social injustice. Violence and social injustice were central elements in the daily life of Sodom and Gomorrah. Society was immersed in acts of oppression, where force and intimidation prevailed over justice and equity. Disrespect for human life and dignity became the norm, reflecting a culture that had lost its way. Instead of promoting peace and harmony, the cities were scenes of conflicts and injustices, where the weak were often targets of the powerful. The biblical narrative suggests that this violence was not limited to isolated actions, but was a defining trait of the culture. Interpersonal relationships were marked by distrust, and solidarity among community members seemed to have disappeared. In a society so marked by oppression, collective morality deteriorated, paving the way for anarchy and chaos. Instead of coming together to solve their problems, citizens turned against each other. Social injustice was also evident in the relationships between different classes and groups. The most vulnerable, such as the poor and foreigners, were often the most affected by violence and lack of protection. The ethics of justice, which should have been a pillar of society, was replaced by a system that favored the powerful and ignored the needy. This inequality became unsustainable and, according to the narrative, was one of the reasons that led to the city's condemnation. The constant presence of violence and social injustice created a vicious cycle of distrust and resentment. People, feeling threatened, became more aggressive and less willing to cooperate. As a result, society fragmented further and interpersonal relationships deteriorated. What should have been a united community turned into a battleground, where the survival of the fittest was the only rule. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is often seen as a reflection of divine judgment on the moral corruption and injustice that permeated society. The narrative invites us to reflect on the importance of promoting justice and peace in our own communities. The story serves as a warning about what can happen when violence and oppression become the norm and how these practices can lead to devastating consequences for everyone involved. Deviation from spiritual values. In Sodom and Gomorrah, spiritual values were completely distorted. The inhabitants strayed from monotheistic beliefs that promoted ethics and morality. Known for their worship of pagan gods, the cities were a true cauldron of practices that would be considered abominable today. This included everything from fertility rituals to human sacrifices, which were seen as a way to appease deities that, according to their beliefs, demanded extreme offerings. The connection with the divine was replaced by the pursuit of immediate pleasures and macabre rituals. This deviation was not just a matter of personal choice, it permeated the entire society. Traditions that once kept the community united were abandoned in favor of practices that disregarded life and human dignity. The pursuit of selfish satisfaction and the worship of distorted values created an atmosphere of moral corruption. What could have been a space of compassion and respect turned into fertile ground for depravity. The inhabitants became prisoners of their own lack of ethics. Even more alarming was the normalization of these practices. Over time, the worship of pagan gods and abominable rituals ceased to be seen as something to be avoided. On the contrary, they became an integral part of daily life. Festivals celebrating these gods became increasingly common, and traditional morality was eclipsed by a new order that valued depravity above spirituality. Thus, Sodom and Gomorrah became living examples of how the deviation from spiritual values can lead a society to ruin. The consequences of this departure from ethical and spiritual values were disastrous. As the inhabitants distanced themselves from any notion of compassion or justice, society began to fragment. The lack of a solid moral foundation resulted in an environment of distrust and hostility. The solidarity that could have existed among the inhabitants was replaced by indifference. And as spirituality faded, the void left by its absence was filled with selfishness and rivalry. And of course, we cannot forget that these spiritual distortions did not go unnoticed. For many, The worship of pagan gods and the practice of abominable rituals were signs of an imminent moral collapse. Divine messengers, like Lot, were sent to warn the inhabitants about the transgressions they were committing, but the rejection of these warnings only served to solidify the idea that the city was irredeemably lost. Before any catastrophe, there are always warnings, right? In Sodom and Gomorrah, this was no different. The inhabitants of these cities received direct warnings from divine messengers, which were essentially calls for reflection and change. Lot, who was Abraham's nephew, stood out as a solitary voice amid the clamor of an insensitive society. He tried with all his might to warn his neighbors about what was about to happen. But, as often happens in stories of warning, his words were ignored. The residents were so immersed in their decadent lifestyles that they couldn't perceive the approaching danger. Daily life, filled with festivities and immoral practices, had created a sort of spiritual anesthesia. When Lot tried to dialogue, many looked at him as if he were an intruder, someone who didn't belong in that world of excesses. Instead of listening, they preferred to mock his attempts at salvation. Ignorance became an armor that protected them from the truth that Lot tried to reveal. The rejection of prophetic messages wasn't just an act of disdain, it was a clear manifestation of a culture in decline. In Sodom and Gomorrah, what could be seen as an opportunity for redemption was treated as a threat to the lifestyle they had built. Those who should have been receptive to the warnings became defenders of their transgressions, preferring to remain in darkness rather than confront the light that Lot tried to bring. This resistance to divine warnings is a constant in human history. Often, people prefer to ignore the obvious signs that something is wrong. In Sodom and Gomorrah, this tendency culminated in a point of no return. The city, which could have transformed by listening to Lot's words, chose the path of denial. And so, while the divine messengers tried to draw attention to the wrongdoing, the clamor of immorality and injustice echoed louder. In the end, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah serves as a reminder that, even in the face of clear warnings, many prefer to follow their own paths, ignoring the advice that could have changed their destinies. When destruction finally came, it was not just a matter of punishment, but a tragic consequence of choices made by a society that refused to listen. Collective consequences of sin. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is often seen as a milestone in the biblical narrative, where the collective decisions of society led to a tragic outcome. The inhabitants of these cities, in their unrestrained pursuit of pleasures and freedom, completely ignored the warnings surrounding their actions. The idea that sin is not an isolated issue, but rather a phenomenon that affects the collective is central to this story. When a society deviates from ethical and moral values, the consequences can be devastating for all its members, not just those who commit the condemnable actions. The moral corruption that prevailed in Sodom and Gomorrah was not something that affected only a small group. Instead, it was a defining characteristic of daily life, where promiscuity, violence, and lack of solidarity were present at all levels. This raises important questions about collective responsibility. To what extent is each individual in a society responsible for the behavior of others? It is easy to point fingers at those who commit immoral acts, but what about those who remain silent or accept this reality as normal? The idea that the consequences of sin are collective also leads us to reflect on the nature of divine judgment. In the biblical narrative, the destruction of the cities is not just an act of revenge, but a reflection of the miserable state in which society found itself. It is as if the land, the community, and the universe as a whole had aligned to correct a great injustice. This perspective forces us to consider that by neglecting justice and morality in our lives, we may be contributing to a cycle of destruction that affects everyone. Moreover, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah makes us think about the importance of solidarity and empathy in a society. When people distance themselves from one another, focusing only on their desires and personal interests, social cohesion breaks down. The consequences of this are visible in many contemporary societies, where lack of empathy and indifference to the suffering of others can lead to social and humanitarian crises. The narrative invites us to reflect on the need to care for each other, promoting values that protect human dignity and life. Finally, viewing the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah as a collective consequence of sin teaches us that morality is not just a private matter, but a public good. The actions of one individual can influence the lives of many, and the health of a society depends on its members' ability to unite around ethical and moral principles. The story serves as a warning not to ignore the signs of moral degradation around us, reminding us that the responsibility for justice and social well-being lies with all of us. Symbolism and moral lessons. The narrative of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is rich in symbolism and offers moral lessons that resonate through the ages. At its core, this story serves as a warning about the dangers of moral degradation and lack of compassion. In a world where the boundaries between right and wrong can seem blurred, the story of these two places invites us to reflect on the consequences of our choices and the importance of maintaining ethical values in our daily lives. One of the main symbols in the narrative is the idea that justice must prevail. The destruction of the cities is seen as a divine response to injustice and lack of morality. This brings us to a crucial point. Justice is not just a theoretical concept, but a practical requirement in human interactions. When people ignore justice in favor of their desires, the result is a society in ruins, where violence and oppression become the norm. This lesson is especially relevant in times when many feel disillusioned with the institutions that should guarantee justice. The lack of hospitality and welcoming in Sodom and Gomorrah also offers a strong symbolism. By rejecting visitors and strangers, the cities demonstrated an absence of compassion that ultimately led to their ruin. This message resonates strongly in contemporary society, where xenophobia and indifference to others are on the rise. The story reminds us of the importance of welcoming and caring for those who are different from us, promoting an environment of solidarity and respect. Another important aspect of the symbolism is the relationship between individual morality and collective well-being. The narrative suggests that every small act of injustice or immorality contributes to a larger picture of degradation. This leads us to consider the responsibility each of us has in our daily actions. The way we treat people around us, even in situations that seem insignificant, can have a profound impact on society. This idea is an invitation to reflect on how our choices shape the world we live in. Finally, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah symbolizes the need for moral vigilance. The narrative reminds us that just as these cities were destroyed for their transgressions, contemporary societies can also face severe consequences if they are not careful with their values. The story urges us to always be alert and to act for justice, compassion, and human dignity, cultivating an environment where everyone can thrive and live in harmony. Hey everyone! Now that we've explored the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, it's time to reflect on what it all means for us today. The destruction of these cities was not just an event of the past, it's a powerful warning about the choices we make and the consequences they can bring. Have you ever thought about the things that lead us away from a more just and loving path? Each of us faces temptations and challenges, but the real question is, how can we learn from the mistakes of the past? Are we somehow repeating the same behaviors that led to the downfall of these cities? And what if the transformation started with us? Imagine living in a world where compassion and justice prevail. It's an invitation to change, an opportunity to reflect on our attitudes and those of the society around us. How about starting this journey today? So, leave your comment below. What's your take on this story? What do you think we can do to create a more loving and welcoming environment? Let's reflect together.